However, I say this, by the 2040s it's highly unlikely we'll be using fossil fuels in agriculture worldwide. There needs to be a crash global research effort to head off a farm energy crisis. Why? If you can make out the graph, if consumers had to pay $25 or $30 for a loaf of bread, and proportionately much for beef, I think they might get a little stroppy, don't you? Although we might enjoy it. If you look at the graph, that little kick on the extreme right-hand end is what happened when oil went to $160 a barrel in 2008. That big kick up there is what happened in the 1970s oil crisis. That's grain prices. That's what happens to grain prices when oil runs short. You need to think about the implications for livestock of a tripling in grain prices. What does this mean for grain-fed beef and for pasture-fed beef? Adding to the uncertainty about protein supplies is a marine time bomb. Fisheries scientists tell us that 29% of the world's fisheries are already in a state of collapse, and the majority could be gone by the 2040s if we don't do something about it. FAO says that the maximum wild capture fishery potential from the world's oceans has probably been reached. That means we're not going to get much more protein from the seas. If we can't double the fish catch, we're going to have to get 100 million tonnes of extra protein from somewhere else, beef cattle maybe. At the same time, FAO is predicting a 185 million tonne increase in world demand for meat. You add these two things together, and just to put it in perspective for you, we're actually going to have to discover 3 more North Americas in order to produce the feed for all those animals. That's how large the challenge is. Of course, a lot of this challenge is going to have to take place in a context of climates becoming less predictable, when the main grain regions are forecast to dry out. The UK's Hadley Centre, that's that kind of wiggly graph there, has produced a model which faithfully reproduces what has happened in history, and the forward throw of that model shows that we're likely to have about 40% of the world's agricultural areas in drought by the end of this century. Regular drought. That's mainly going to affect the Great Grain Bowls. Their soil moisture projection, sorry the map's rather small, suggests that the areas that we once thought of as having great potential, like Brazil, Southern Africa and the Indian Grain Bowl, may prove unreliable. Our crops and agricultural systems are adapted to climates which are about to become extinct, is how Kerry Fowler, who runs the Svalbard Seed Vault, puts it. The International Food Policy Research Institute warns of a 30% drop in irrigated wheat in Asia and 15% in rice due to climate factors. Australia is already the canary in the coal mine, experiencing reduced food potential, especially in southern Australia, maybe not in the north, as a result of changing climates. If we fail to adapt, CSIRO says we could be importing grain irregularly by 2050. Basically what this comes down to is a thing called ecological overshoot. It means we're taking more out of the planet's resources than we're putting back every year. Currently we're using about 30% more than one planet provides. We keep on doing that, we're going to need 2 planets. If every person ate like an American, an Australian, a European, we'd actually need 4 planets to support us all. Put simply, what that means is that today's diets and food production systems are not sustainable in the long run. We need to reinvent them. Now, this is the size of the challenge facing the coming generation of graziers and farmers. It's to double the global food supply, using half the water, on far less land, with increasingly depleted soils, without fossil fuels, with scarce and costlier fertiliser and chemicals, under the hammer of climate change. It's a big ask. It's about time the world paid attention to it. Added to this challenge, producers may have to do this using less science and technology. On top of all the scarcities of water and land and energy and nutrients, we're driving into a big technology pothole. And the reason is that governments around the world, including our own, have decided to slash resources for agricultural research and extension for over decades. Not just in Australia, it's also happened in the US, in Germany, Britain, France, Japan and China. In the year 2000, the wealthy countries of the world spent just 1.8 cents in every dollar on food research. That's how unimportant this area, this critical area, has become to them. Between 1980 and 2006, the proportion of the world's aid budget devoted to raising food production fell from 17 to just 3%. So the aid agencies don't think this is important any longer. Let me put it in perspective for you. Today, the world spends about $40 billion a year on agricultural research of one sort or another. And it spends $1,500 billion a year on weapons. That gives you some sense of humanity's current priorities. There's been no real increase in funding for R&D, really, since the 1970s, especially for international R&D. And the evidence is already there in a drop-off in the rate of yield gains that we're seeing around the world. What it means is basically less new technology is coming your way, coming the way of farmers struggling in third world countries and so on, than in the past. The rate of technology diffusion from countries like Australia out to developing countries is going to slow down, because a lot of the technology we have here they can't use there anyway because it needs a lot of oil or a lot of training or something. I would say also there's another issue here. It's time to end the argument over which is the best farming system to feed the world. Technologically advanced broadacre systems or efficient organic smallholder agriculture. Each of these produces about half the world's food. We can't abolish one and promote the other without causing an absolute catastrophe. So now is the time for both strands of thought to come together. We need to invent the new, efficient, low-input, high-yield, sustainable food system of the future. This is the new eco-agriculture, which we have yet to invent. And as advanced producers, it is your task to invent it. Creating this eco-agriculture, I would argue, is humanity's most urgent scientific challenge. I can think of nothing higher than this, not curing cancer, nothing. This new food production system has to be science-based. It has to be low input. It has to replenish, not destroy. And it has to work for producers large and small, everywhere. If we fail, the consequences will be profound. Modern wars are often driven by scarcities of food, land and water. Darfur, Rwanda, Eritrea, the Balkans were all destabilised at root by squabbles over these resources. Going further back, the French and Russian civil wars both grew out of bread crises. We know that hunger breeds war. The UK Ministry of Defence, which developed this threat map, America's CIA, the US Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and the Oslo Peace Research Institute all identify famine as a potential trigger for conflicts, and possibly even nuclear wars. However, the obvious good news in this is that many of these wars can be avoided by meeting the rising demand for food, despite the constraints I've identified. The other aspect is the number of refugees that are fanning out across the world. A big future famine in any significant region, in Africa, India, Central Asia, China, Indonesia, the Middle East, or any of the megacities, would confront the world with tidal waves of tens, even hundreds of millions of refugees. The 50 million refugees who now flee every year some kind of a war or a famine are actually being preceded by a more orderly tide of 200 million people who've seen trouble coming and they're moving to avoid it. So 1/4 of a billion human beings are on the move now every